Welcome to EVONA Origin Stories, the space podcast where we look to bring you extraordinary leaders from within the sector and their fascinating stories of early life, career, and how they broke into the space industry.
Today's podcast is for Jeroen at Spire. Jeroen's one of the co-founders. He's been with Spire obviously from the start and helped them to scale on an international basis. He's an engineer at heart, extremely humble, and this podcast is really worth a listen for anyone that's either looking to set up their own space company or looking for some really solid advice on how to be successful within NewSpace. Been really excited to speak to you, Jeroen. I do know quite a bit about Spire. However, it'd be really cool to understand your story, understand how you entered into the sector and sort of where it all began. So thanks very much for taking the time out to speak to us.
Yeah, for sure. Happy to be here.
Cool. Yes. So the idea of this podcast is to really look to potentially inspire people that, I guess, of all ages that might want to enter into the space industry. And I think if we can tell people stories and it inspires at least one person to move off the couch and think, actually, I'm going to give it a go. I'm going to start my own business, or I'm going to enter the space industry. That's pretty much our goal. So yeah, so it'd be really cool to hear your story, I guess, right from the start. So could you paint a picture for us in terms of right from the early days? I'm talking about school and right from the start.
Yeah, for sure. And I always start by saying that I was never one of those people, who knew they wanted to go into the space industry when they grew up, or was into sci-fi, or was like, oh my God, space, I want to be an astronaut. I was never one of those people. For me, it started mostly at college. So I grew up in Belgium, went to university there. At some point, I had an option for studying certain subjects or not, and then ended up choosing Aerospace and Aeronautics. And that's where the bug kind of bit me, I would say. And again, it wasn't the aspirational nature of space necessarily, but more the complexity of the technical problems that was interesting me. I figured out that it's a really interesting environment to work in and solve problems in, and it's a place where traditionally, a lot of the technical solutions were kind of lagging behind other industries, and at the same time, you could start seeing the impact from other industries on the space industry. The innovations in robotics, automobile, smartphones, etc. So I thought it was both an interesting technical challenge, and it seemed like a very good time to jump into that industry. And that's really where I made the leap to get into it.
So in terms of kind of choosing the course then, so did you have the same perception that most of us have about the space industry? It must just be astronauts and surely that's it. And then you kind of fell into the aerospace course then and then realized it was much more, or did you already know that there was a bit more to it?
No, I think from being in school and understanding what was going on there, I had a good understanding of all the applications of it, and traditionally the various sectors that were in there, like navigation and communications and end user equipment. I think what I didn't understand until much later is that's not all there is to it. There's many more applications that can be enabled by space and by doing space in different ways. And by including innovation from different sectors, enabling many more people to do things in space enables a whole new ecosystem. I think that was an important realization also in later developing Spire.
Yeah, it's always really interesting because people kind of stumble across space at different points in their career. So in terms of the other people on your course as such, were they into space as well? Or was it just yourself?
Oh, well, some of them totally were. And for some of them, it was that, bug that bit them when they were young and they played with Star Wars Legos or whatever, or always wanted to be an astronaut. For some of them, it was also more the technical challenge. And for some of them, it was, just a temporary interest, and they went on to do other things. And it was just kind of an exploration of, what does it look like? So I think, different people experienced it differently. Then after my engineering studies, I went to do the International Space University because I wanted to get a bit of a broader view of the space industry as a whole, not just the engineering piece. And so I spent a year there, which was very useful to kind of understand all these different other aspects that are involved in the space ecosystem, whether it's building businesses and how to get funding, or the legal and regulatory environments, or how to connect the science with the systems engineering, the applications. All those things were kind of explored there, and that was a very useful thing. And then there, you really did have a group of people that were passionate about enabling technologies and developments to be able to use space for many more things, for newer applications. So I think that was a very good environment to be in, to explore some of these new ideas.
Yeah. Okay. So the International Space University. So how did you identify that? Where did that idea sort of arise?
Well, after my engineering studies, I wanted to dive a little bit further into space, and I looked around a little bit to the various offerings that were out there. Most of them were additional engineering courses. It's diving deeper into satellite systems engineering or propulsion, rocketry, or kind of specific elements. And I didn't really want to do that. I felt I had a good enough technical grasp of some of these elements, and I was more interested in a broader look on what does the ecosystem look like, so that I can decide which path to take, so that I'm not being guided in a direction just by my technical interest, but more so by where might this go a little bit longer term. And that International Space University, I think, is one of the only places that you can really do that. The other thing I think that was interesting about going there is they have a very extensive network of people that are placed all over in the space industry, from the agencies to industry to defense, academia. There's really a very wide network. So it kind of opens up some doors that otherwise you wouldn't be able to get through. And also enabled me, for example, as a European, to go spend some time at NASA for a little while, which is not that straightforward otherwise. So I did feel like that was a good option.
Okay, and was that sort of a stepping stone into the startup world then, would you say, or like what, were you doing a different job at the same time that you were studying? What did that look like? What was your work life like throughout this period?
Yeah. Certainly not intentionally. I hadn't gone into that program with the intention of starting a company afterwards, but it did develop into that when we were there and met Peter and Joel, our other co-founders. And it's not that I wasn't busy, because it's a very dense one-year program. But towards the middle of the year, we kind of started looking at what's next. And then, either you kind of have the prospect of going to work for big space, at least at that point, 10 years ago, the startup ecosystem was a little bit less vibrant, or doing something new, doing something different, trying something else, trying to start something from scratch. And so there was always that backup option of stepping into ESA or NASA or one of the big contractors or that world. But we felt strongly that we really wanted to do something hands-on. Didn't want to end up just being behind the desk and talking about requirements and working on missions that take 10 years to develop. We felt there was a movement starting that was able to do things quicker and differently. So we at least wanted to dip our toe in the water and see, can we be part of this? Can we make something happen here? And that's how it started. And we started, by trying to build business plans and competing in these business plan competitions, applying to various incubators who had, of course, never heard of space companies applying, so they all rejected us. But it helped us to build our story and narrative and explore what is useful, what is not useful, and helped us end up where eventually we ended up.
Yeah. So how did you meet the guys? I'm just keen to understand. So you're obviously doing a course. Like, who spoke to who first? How did that interaction start?
I met Joel in a bar before the program started, when we were still, everybody had arrived. We hadn't done any courses yet. He's Canadian, so we were hanging out. But obviously, it didn't turn into a conversation about starting companies much later. And then Peter, I think, during some of the first weeks of the program, and he's got a very interesting profile, coming from the banking world, but also having spent time at CERN. So he's got this kind of mixed background, and I hadn't really met anybody with that kind of background. So it was very interesting conversations that I had with him as well. And just over time, started working on these things together.
Yeah, and sort of working with co-founders, I guess, for anybody that's setting up a startup, the right co-founders it's super important, because you need to, you're not always going to be the best of friends, but at the same time, you need to kind of have respect for each other. So were you, like, when you started to meet these guys, did you start thinking, actually, I could see myself working with these guys, or was it more talking about the technology and the culture? Like, I guess, what was it that sort of made you guys come together?
Well, I think that shared sense of, we don't want to just end up being another pawn in this big space industry. A shared sense of, like, we feel like we have a very, very, very long shot of doing something different, and we at the moment don't have much to lose, so we might as well put our heads together and try and do it. And we did develop a working relationship that was very efficient, I think. And we had kind of a just get shit done mentality, where we would just spend the time needed to do the thing, because we were passionate about it. So I don't know if there was much balance at that point. It was just going very hard to trying to get something off the ground.
Yeah. So can you talk me through, like, those very early stages? So you've broken away from the university. So were you working another job at the same time to sort of pay the rent, as it were, or like, how did it, like, talk us through those proper early days of actually setting up the business?
Yeah. So a couple of us then went off to NASA Ames in California to do our internships. Myself and Peter, and then Joel was doing something in Europe. But in the meantime, we were trying to set up the company, and that was also a very good opportunity to start talking to people, start understanding the environment a little bit better, look at what funding really means. None of us has really fundraised for a startup before. Let alone a space company. We actually started trying to do that a little bit in Europe, but it became clear pretty quickly that, back then, 10 years ago, that just wouldn't have been an option. There just wasn't any appetite for that level of risk, especially not in the space industry. It was very slow, and the amounts of funding that we're talking about would just not have been meaningful for a capital-intensive business like a space company. So being physically there in Silicon Valley and NASA Ames enabled us to just talk to a lot of people, find people that liked the idea, explore how we could refine the ideas, which direction to take it into. We then eventually started a Kickstarter campaign in the summer of 2012, I think, which was kind of our breaking point to say, if this is successful, let's keep doing it. If it's not, let's just go our own ways and do our own thing. But let's at least give this thing a chance. That then ended up being successful pretty quickly, and so we all committed. So yes, let's try to do this thing for real. At that point, we had found an incubator in San Francisco called Lemnos Labs that was taken in mostly hardware companies. So they were focused on companies that are developing physical things, not just space, but also in the consumer world and in other industries. And so we joined them in September 2012, I guess, which was really the point of incorporation of the company, and spent maybe half a year there. That's when we got our first funding. That's when we hired our first people, and eventually we got big enough that they kicked us out and went and got our own office. But it was a great environment to be in because we were there together with a bunch of other companies, not necessarily from the space industry. There was one company building a hamburger making machine, and there's one company building a coffee machine, a baby monitor, parking monitors. So and every week we sat next to those companies over bagels, and we're like, okay, how many customers did you talk to this week? How many investors did you talk to? And it was really energizing to be in that kind of environment, seeing what other people develop, looking at other people's milestones that are not necessarily in your industry, but are doing similar things, similar developments. Also, obviously they connected us to investors and advisors and help with funding and the things that incubators normally do. And that was a great environment to kind of grow the first phase. And then I think we got up to maybe 8 people or something before we moved out into our own first office after our first round of funding, and must have been early 2013.
Well, yeah, lots of interesting lessons there. I mean, we've always, so just from a kind of recruiting standpoint, we only started to really work with businesses in the US maybe like 4 years ago. And what struck us about it, just from working with startups in the US, is that there's not a stigma attached to failure like we feel like there can be over in Europe. And it's just that people are willing to give things a go. People are willing to kind of give things a try, which is evident across all startups. But just from a cultural perspective, we sort of see it more. And it's interesting what you said there. You guys were like, this might work, it might not, but do you know what? Let's really give it a go. And then the second point is obviously when you do set up a company, going in there and being in an environment around other startups, completely unrelated, but in that environment, in that culture, in that it's just encouraging, it's exciting, it's fast paced. So I guess, anybody listening that's thinking about setting up their own company, a massive thing is obviously don't be afraid of failure. I mean, do you feel like that was something there was that real sense between the three of you at the start? Were you, or what, at a certain point did you go, this is going to be an absolute success? Or, even up to now, are you scared of failure, or are you kind of encouraged by it?
I wouldn't say scared is the right word. Definitely aware that it might be around the corner. And it's also, I don't think it's as binary as success and failure. I think it's more about finding the right thing to do. Because I think, initially in a startup, you start with some idea and you change it 100 times before it becomes the thing that the company ends up doing. We're 10 years in now, and we must have changed the idea dozens of times at least. And I think early investors understand that and know that as well. And for them, it's more about you have the right team and you have the passion to be relentless enough to get through these early messy stages where you're going to build products that don't work and have customers yell at you and almost run out of money and those kinds of things, right? I think it's a lot of it is about persistence and getting through that and understanding that success is very nonlinear. And you've got to experiment with some things before you'll understand what it is that you're meant to be doing. So I think that was mostly our mindset. It was just, we need to do things to understand what we're doing wrong, to be able to get better, to understand what we need to do right, to eventually get there.
Yeah, absolutely. So 3 guys based in the US, started in San Francisco in an incubator. Did you say that you got to 8 people before you then went out and kind of had your own office space then? So how did that work from like a visa perspective? Obviously you guys are European and you set up a business in the US. Was it spun out of visas from the university or how did you manage that?
Yeah, I mean, we had to work around that. For myself, I went back to Europe for a bit and worked from there while visa stuff was sorted out. I think for Peter and Joel, it was easier because they had US and Canadian affiliation. But yeah, that certainly had to be sorted out. I was NASA on what is it, like student or exchange visa or something, certainly not you can work on. So I had to apply for the proper H-1B, I think it is.
Okay, cool. Okay, so, and then what happened next then? So you obviously had 8 people, like you say, you're obviously speaking to people to fund the business. What was next?
Well, at that point, between our own funding, the Kickstarter money, and the seed funding that had come in, we had enough funding to build and launch our first couple of satellites. So we were just really going hard to get that done, because we were going from napkin to space in like 9 to 12 months or something like that. Right? That was our goal. So we just had to go really hard. We moved to our own office, hired a couple more people, but then it was just a matter of execution, just grinding it out to develop and build those first satellites. At the same time, the first person we hired was not an engineer, but was a business person, because we wanted to very early on start understanding where is the market exactly, and what applications should we be building, so that we're not letting the technology drive the solution, but we want to let the market drive the solution, and try to find a good match between the technologies that we had and could build and markets that were ready for that kind of thing. So those two activities went on in parallel then, while we built our first satellites and started talking to potential markets and customers.
Interesting. Nice. So you were already thinking ahead, how can we commercialize this product right from the outset, which is really, really interesting. And then so kind of fast forward a little bit then. So Spire are an international business. How did that work in terms of the next office, the next location? How was that chosen?
Yeah, I mean, from the beginning, we were set up very international. 3 founders from 3 different countries, some affiliation with the US, but none of us was born there. So we were always thinking, we wanted to be a global company, and part of the mission very early on was also we wanted to solve global challenges, which couldn't really do without being a global company. So we're definitely looking at that early on. I think our first office ended up being Singapore in, I want to say 2014, 15, that kind of time frame. At that point, we're looking at the maritime market. Obviously Singapore, huge hub there. Also great engineering resources there, and in that part of the world. We're also in discussion with the local people, development agencies and such there, and they were interested in having us. So that ended up being our first location. Then after that, we were looking for a location in Europe. We wanted to put our manufacturing facilities there, and again talk to a number of people, and based on factors really related mostly to one, do the local people want us there? I think that to help us integrate and build networks and help with talent and such. The quality and availability of the talent, and the presence of other companies in the ecosystem that we wanted to operate in. That's how we ended up in Glasgow in the UK in late 2015. And then after that, we opened a couple more facilities in the US. So in addition to San Francisco, we have Boulder, Colorado, as a huge hub in the weather community, Washington, DC, and then we've got Luxembourg now, and most recently with the acquisition of formerly Exact Earth, we've got a facility near Toronto now in Canada, and a couple of other small facilities stippled across the world.
Wow, so all over the world then. And how have you kind of maintained, I guess, the culture, or with the company being so international, it's such an opportunity to think internationally, especially when you're growing a tech startup, because obviously from a talent perspective, it allows you to hire people from all over the world. So how have you kind of maintained the culture of Spire, or what would you say that the culture is of Spire?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. In fact, some of our early investors were really advising against opening international offices so early on because of those difficulties, both logistically and culturally. But it was just kind of in our blood. So early on, we worked together very, very closely as a single team, essentially. So there were handoffs, and you got to know Singapore, US, and Glasgow are approximately all 8 hours apart.
Yeah.
Time zone wise. And so we were essentially just handing off, office to office at the beginning and the ending of every day. Because we were working on the same projects, getting the first production batch of satellites ready, and the software for that, and the infrastructure for that. So that's the way we work together. Then as we scaled up a little bit and got more critical mass in each of those offices, they started standing on their own, but they had been steeped in that, working together very closely. And we'd also, had people travel between the offices quite a bit, so that culture could be established. And at that point, we kind of had the seed of the culture in the various offices, and it kind of grew from there. It was more difficult when we started up, entirely new offices from scratch rapidly. Or most recently we just as I said, acquired Cappaert, which is entirely existing established company, with a set of people that have a certain culture. So it's just learning how to work together best in that kind of environment, and it's definitely different when you're 20 people versus when you're 400 people. And there's different methods and different ways of communicating that you have to use to establish that. Definitely feel a lot less in control now, and you gotta trust the people that work for you, that they've got the right values and you've hired them in the right way, so that they can distribute that culture. Because in the end, culture, it's not what the management says culture is. It's what lives amongst the people and the employees, so that that there's not always a match between those.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you find yourself telling people how they need to be for the culture, that's not really culture. You can drive it and you can nurture it, but ultimately it is what it is. Absolutely on the same page with that. So we've obviously gone through the story. We're now a fully kind of international business. And are you guys kind of like open to hiring across the world then? Like what's the latest from that perspective?
Yeah, so I mean, we're 10 years in. We've got 6-7 offices globally. Certainly wouldn't say we're done yet, or that we feel like we're fully global yet. I think there's still a lot of headway to make there, and a lot of places to explore, and there's a lot of talent pools that we haven't really tapped in yet. And obviously, it also relates to where our markets are and such. So we'll just we'll keep growing. We also understand better now what the strengths and weaknesses are of the various cultures and environments that we've got offices in. Some things are easier in the US, not as easy in Europe. The other way around, some profiles are easier to find in Singapore than in Luxembourg. So we start to understand our existing environment a bit better, so we can work with it better as well. And I think that'll be the key going forward as well, in establishing centers of excellence in various places where it's relevant from both a business and a technology perspective, getting critical mass there and hiring further. We do value in-person collaboration quite highly. In some areas, you just can't not do it. Like people need to be in a clean room and working on hardware and labs and stuff like that. You can't just hire people wherever. But even in areas where we don't have that physical constraint, we do strongly believe that in-person collaboration is important. So we try to not get too distributed in terms of having individual people in various random locations. We try to very much keep things centered around our offices.
Yeah, really interesting. Sort of pre-COVID, most companies insisted on having people kind of on site 100%. Then COVID happened and people went, actually, we can make this work and everybody can work from home. And I think now it's coming to a point where everyone's like, actually, we really do actually need the in-person meetings and the collaboration and that support to really push things forward. And it's just interesting how it's kind of unfolded. So what sort of advice would you give to somebody that's looking to enter into the space industry? Because and I say space industry, it's obviously more than that, but somebody, whether you're a student or whether you're very, very senior and you're looking at it and you're thinking, maybe I'm not qualified for it, or maybe I have to be a national or whatever it is. Have you got any advice that you would give to somebody that's maybe looking to enter?
That's always difficult because I think, one path of success, or whatever we call it so far, is not necessarily easy to duplicate or can be followed to get to other places. But I think surround yourself with great people, with smart people that are smarter than you, ideally. Be in the right place to be able to access opportunities. So talk to people in the industry, go to conferences, go to schools that are relevant, participate online in discussions, just be part of the conversation and educate yourself about all the opportunities that are going on. To some extent also, think differently a little bit, try to see what hasn't been done yet, that could be done given some of the developments that are happening today, rather than trying to be a copy of something else that exists today. And that's tricky, in some environments. Today we're seeing a funding environment where there's a lot more money available for the space industry, but at the same time it's still relatively conservative in that people fund what they understand and what already exists relatively easily. If you're a copy of an existing company but slightly different, they've seen that business model, they understand how that works. They've got an example that's successful or getting to a point of exit, and that's an easy path to funding. I think there's less obvious ones where you're really trying to provide new value and doing something that hasn't been done before. That's still a tricky path, and still a tricky thing to do, and still challenging to get funding for. But I think those are the more interesting paths. So I think, those are the things I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. That networking piece, putting yourself in the right place, right place, right time is a thing, but you have to be in the place in the first place. And so people need to think, just I guess research and just look for the opportunities. And if you do that, and then like you say, if you surround yourself with people that make you feel good, that inspire you, that push you, that's typically where things start to spark. So I heard a story about Spire, that you guys apparently named some of the satellites in your constellation after some of your staff members. So I'd be really, really keen if you could just paint a picture for us in terms of Spire, the technology, as I understand it, satellites that are about the size of, like, I guess, some wine or maybe a loaf of bread or something. And then the use cases vary, but effectively to do with weather and to do with maritime and a few others. So it'd be really, really good just to get an update in terms of Spire, the technology, and what it's like to be in Spire. Because the space industry at the moment, there is a bit of pushback around space tourism from people. It's frustrating as hell because it's such a tiny part of the industry when actually most space companies are actually improving Earth. So it's a very long question, but ultimately be really keen to understand the technology in Spire, and what it's like to work there.
Yeah, I'll try to do that briefly. So, first and foremost, Spire is a data services and analytics company. I don't think we would classify ourselves as a space company, or at least as only a space company. Our product is, data and services. If you're a customer of us, you will get an API, you will get data in some shape or form, whether that's emailed to you or whether it's on a visualization or through some of our modern APIs. Whether that's some of the data that we provide through our own satellite network by default, like the maritime data, aviation data, or whether that's for custom purpose that you've, as a customer, worked with us on, and we've developed satellites or technology for you and are launching that. It'll arrive with you in the same easy way through some API or interface where you can control and do things. So that's what we're trying to provide in the end. Because of where and when we started, we've built a lot of technology to enable that. So we own all of the IP on our satellites, build them all ourselves. We got our own ground station network, all the constellation management that sits behind that, satellite operations, all the data processing. We do pretty much everything in house except launch the satellites. So there's a strong sense of technology ownership, but at the same time, we're not in the business of selling satellites. So we do that all with the purpose of providing data and services to our customers as best as we can, because we believe that model is fundamentally where we should be going, and that providing data as a service is much better than having these customers that don't necessarily want anything to do with space, having to own all the assets, build all the infrastructure, to only then get to their core business. So that's kind of where we're at today. As I said, our main businesses that we're in, maritime, aviation, weather data, but also weather forecasting and weather forecasting products, and then any type of bespoke space services that anybody wants to get anything done in orbit. We started with 3U CubeSats as our first production constellation in 2015. We had some smaller satellites before that. But in the meantime, we've scaled up to 6Us, of which we've launched a couple, and might do some larger in the future, to be determined. But we've been able to do a lot with that technology. Most of what we do is radio frequency based, so we're not an imaging company. We kind of grew up at the same time as companies like Planet Labs, and they were the imaging company, we're the radio frequency company. So we collect all kinds of data, whether it pertains to communications or earth science, or monitoring of activity on Earth. Any of that is kind of in our wheelhouse across the frequency spectrum. I think that may be a good brief introduction.
Yeah, no, that certainly sums it up. And talking of kind of the bespoke pieces of work, obviously we've got a major issue around the world at the moment focused in Ukraine. So have Spire been able to put the technology to use to help to sort of fund that crisis?
Yeah, I mean, we've been trying, and we've been offering our data to the folks that have been requesting it, and trying to collaborate through the right channels to get that in the hands of those that need it. I've seen a lot of activity in the community, not just at Spire, but in the companies that we know and are close to us, of people stepping up, being willing to help, sharing information, not just with the media, but also with the people actually involved in the conflict. So I think it's an important moment for the industry, trying to actually step up and do something with the data now that we've got all this infrastructure in orbit, showing what you can really do from space.
100%, yeah, for sure. There's so much use there. So yeah, it's amazing to see, like you say, almost across the board, really, businesses just stepping up, almost like a pro bono type approach to it. So look, we just want to help, basically. So yeah, well, look, thank you very much for your story. I guess just one final question, which was good to ask. Are you able to pick out perhaps the best advice you've ever received from somebody, but also the worst advice that you've ever received from somebody?
Oh yeah, that's always difficult. I think the best advice, early on has always been, don't think too much about your idea that you have, that, obviously you start a company and you think your initial idea is brilliant and it's going to change the world. Like, don't think of it too much in that way. Just get the right people around you and start building. and you will get to something that is valuable for people. I think that's been an important piece of good advice. I think the bad advice, I think one is the quick money type of advice, like, oh, when you do your first pitch deck, make sure that you know how you're going to exit the company 3 years from now, right? That kind of thing. I think if you're building a company like that, it's not going to be very successful.
I mean, yeah, well, that was two spot on pieces of advice. Don't overthink your idea. Yeah, like having been through it ourselves now, things change now on a daily basis, so you need to be able to embrace the change. Ultimately, the vision does change. Don't get hung up on your first idea, because if it doesn't work, it doesn't work, and don't have an ego about it. And then, if you're trying to build a company to sell it in 3 years, you're probably in it for the wrong reasons in reality, in hindsight. so yeah, absolutely.
Actually, the other piece of bad advice that we got very early on was saying, don't try to do the thing you're doing. It's physically impossible and it's much too hard. So I think that it's just looking beyond what the established truths are, and just questioning one layer deeper and saying, is that really true? Is that really the evolution where technology is going? Maybe that's true today, but might not be tomorrow, right? So just kind of questioning the status quo.
Absolutely, yeah. I think NewSpace as a whole, that is the mentality. And there's always going to be people that don't get it or think that you can't do it. Yeah, amazing. All right, well, thank you very much for taking the time out for that. Really, really, really interesting. Some amazing advice for people of all levels. Ultimately now, you're heading up a very, very cool, very, very important business. So understanding these stories, and it might not feel like it because you're living in it, but actually for a lot of people, it's very inspiring. So yeah, thank you very much for taking the time out.
Yeah, sure. Very, very happy to help. And if there's anyone listening that's interested in a job at Spire, we've got plenty open, so feel free to shoot me an email.
Reach out, absolutely.